Hello, this is Dan, interrupting at the top of the episode to let you know a few things. First off, technology is hard sometimes. Our guest's microphone's cable was misbehaving for the first 30 minutes of this conversation, 35 minutes around there. I still think it's legible. I did a lot of work to recover the audio. I think it's perfectly legible. I just think some of the audio files out there might bristle at some of the static or whatever. I just want to let you know, if you stick around, one, the audio sounds much better after 35 minutes. And two, I think this is kind of a thrilling conversation. And especially the back half of it gets to some places that are well worth getting to. The only other thing to mention is that it is summertime. I hope you all are having a great summer. But what that means for us is where we're recording gets really, really hot. And sometimes it's just better to record with the window open. So there might be a couple of spots where you hear some birds singing. I hope you'll just interpret that as divine agreement to everything that we say. When you hear bird song, it's just divine agreement. I hope that's okay. All right. Enjoy this conversation with Jack Hanson. I think it's a stellar one. I really loved working on this one. Hope you all enjoy it.
There's some sort of profound historical movements and shifting patterns vis-a-vis the church, and how, if we're going to postulate that's a monolithic entity, at least heuristically here, that perceives time. You have the line, they think in centuries, right? Think on the level, I don't like the what are the witches from Dune Abbey, the Bene Gesserit?
The Bene Gesserit.
Nice.
Stop pretending that you are unfamiliar with Dune.
I don't know how to pronounce it. Sorry.
I'm currently re-listening to Dune Messiah, so go on.
Yeah, but thinking in terms of
the last good Dune book.
What are the deep structures of the world system? What are the transitions that are happening? And how do we shape people's expectations and ability to identify with singular figures, right? And there's something, again, on the level of structures I can't quite put a word to, but thinking about John Paul II as, the anti-communist.
Oh, this is Patrick's. Yeah. I actually think I like this theory. Did you not run this by Jack before?
I don't think I did.
Your theory of 20th to 21st century Pope nationality?
Well, I mean, I think it's more just about
No, that's what it is.
Yeah, I guess it is that. Where, and this is in your piece already, where you're there's this Cold War kind of vision of Catholicism, where Catholicism is both this liberatory force. Here I'm not talking about the actual liberation theology, which is what gets obscured by this, but that the state and the Western state and capitalism somehow are in this properly unholy alliance with conservative elements in the church against communism. And the idea that the papacy would be occupied by a Pole, right? Someone from behind the Iron Curtain during the period in which the Soviet Union is collapsing and then passing through that, seems to find some kind of mirroring, or it's in a similar grammar as, well, now we're at the decline of a certain type of American hegemony. And here is a pope from within the fold of that collapsing empire, and he's you can identify he's the good American as opposed to Donald Trump, right? Or there's some sort of recuperation, or again some sort of dance with the world system that's also trying to kind of lead it. I don't know. Does that
absolutely no? I do think that's how they think. It's not a question of in a funny way, for a while Benedict would talk about the church we're basically losing to secularism. Secularism is a real thing that's out there that we have to fight. We have been fighting. We're losing for X, Y, and Z reasons. And he said, well, maybe that's not such a bad thing. The church may be smaller, but it will be pure. And both Francis and Leo have just been that's fucking insane.
Real Inquisition hours. Very on brand for him.
And I do think that curiously enough, in an earlier incarnation of himself, Benedict, as Joseph Ratzinger, said something along these lines, where people who are called progressives in the church tend to just be longer term traditionalists. And there's something about Francis and Leo where, despite being cast as these great reformers and here to shake things up and affect the sea change. They have a much sort of deeper and almost calmer sense of the church's permanence. And so when they got elected, it seemed like two conclaves in which people were just like, the church, as it were, is not the one in question. The world is what is in question. And how are we going to respond to, the changing tides of the world, as opposed to continuing to try to keep pace, even if negatively, which is what to my mind, the Cold War reaction was all about. And then Benedict's sort of, quasi, I never made this connection, quasi Benedict option. He was not an advocate of that, but they shaded into each other a little bit.
I'm so glad that you're hearing that we're thinking about this stuff together, because, well, I suppose I should also kind of make the case to people who are listening to this, what does Catholicism have to do with
suffering?
Yeah. Well, there you go. I mean, that's a cat out of the bag, right? But stepping away from the horse race of this person who heads this institution is a difference in categorical kind. This is out of nowhere, right? This kind of parochial erasure of all the things that produce complex phenomena like this. The thing that really struck me about your piece in Harper's, and then reading the Encyclical in its light, is precisely that kind of orientation towards the world, or this thing that we would call the world as a properly global thing, as a thing that includes the North and South, but that also involves this kind of existential, to use the language, simply stakes of being together in the world, right? That there is suffering in a particular way, or even, and I found myself really finding these parallels between Augustine and Freud here, that desire, right? That what we want kind of mediates how we relate to the world. The world shapes what we desire, but then we impose our desire on the world, and that's a dynamic, ongoing process that can lead into flights of fantasy, can produce certain types of hells on earth, and that you got to have some sort of position to comment on that. It's helpful to have institutions that can kind of stand, if not athwart that, but then can move at a slightly different pace to address those circumstances. And I felt that was, I'm not saying psychoanalysis is a church in this mode, but that a similar type of orientation towards history, towards contingency, and the problem of suffering seemed front and center of this document, and of what's going on right now, why people have been thinking about this.
Yeah, I would also, I think that's totally right. And I would also say that that slower pace also produces a kind of synecdochal relationship, where that kind of ongoing questioning, that navigation and confrontation with desire is happening at a much grander, much broader historical, much slower, in certain ways more visible, in some ways less so, that you can sort of, if not there are many ways of relating to it, right? There are many kinds of reactionary postures one can take of just being well, no, this is the way we articulate our desire. There's one way, and it's been given to us in the catechism or whatever. But there are other ways where you emphasize the questioning and the struggle, and you see this grand institution really as just a vessel. And increasingly, that's the way Francis and Leo and a lot of other, their sort of the theologians who influenced them, that's the way they talked about it. It is a church of sinners. It's a church of questioning. It's a church of a journey, as opposed to somebody like Benedict, who late in his career, not early, curiously enough, again, he was a pretty on kind of the radical cutting edge of Vatican II when he was a young man. Late in his life, he would talk about it in terms of a custodian of a very particular ideal of tradition.
Apropos of the language of questioning, I have to tell you, Jack, that I was absolutely furious by how much I enjoyed this encyclical. Or sorry, I should say that. I was absolutely furious at how good this encyclical is.
I think you had it right the first time.
It's possible. It's really good on education also, and education was a lot more central. I was can Pope Leo maybe come right for the Chronicle of Higher Ed? Because this is, it's much, much better on what AI and misunderstandings of what AI actually is as a thing, what that does to a person who is learning to think and to question and to, to use this word that's very central here, to have discernment. And, it's really, there's this bit about here, I'll just read: the speed and ease with which answers or summaries can be obtained risks extinguishing the desire to ask questions.
Yeah.
And, there is, it's not surprising to find like such a robust defense of what it means to be human, as opposed to what this document calls a kind of perfect machine emanating from the Catholic Church. But it did strike me that like a lot of the values enshrined in both something like psychoanalysis, which is also very like, it's ateleological in some ways. It is all about the sort of slow and, let's say, like unable to use a sort of loaded word, predestine peregrinations that one undertakes in the pursuit of study, learning, reading. It's very, very good on that in ways that are certainly idealistic, but also just very pragmatic.
Uh-huh. Yeah, totally. Because it's not just, it's not, to use a sort of old fashioned word, it's not instrumentalizing thinking. It's a kind of ascesis where the function and the outcome bound up with one another in thinking and in questioning, and it is to reform the self. And given that the self is also the organ of knowing and of desiring, it can't be foreordained. It has to be produced, as it were, in the effort, in real time. And that's what I think that's part of what distinguishes, part of the line of demarcation that Leo's trying to draw between his kind of thinking and like technologist thinking, which is just that the latter has an endpoint in mind, and is interested in producing a particular outcome. As it were, unilaterally. Whereas for Leo and for the Augustinian tradition, but also just like for the whole swath of Catholic tradition, also I think for the psychoanalytic tradition, your question is ultimately also a kind of beseeching and elicitation of somebody else who might want you, like trying to produce conditions in which desire can become truly reciprocal, rather than just this like ongoing expression of my own dissatisfaction.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely made possible by the generous support of our Patreon community. We're so grateful for our Patreon listeners. You make it so that we can keep the show going. If you'd like to support Ordinary Unhappiness, keep it ad-free for everyone, do a little bit for making psychoanalytic education more widely available, please come and find us over at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to welcome Jack Hanson. Jack is a writer, critic, and scholar of religion. His writing has appeared in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Book Review, New York Magazine, The Nation, and elsewhere. Jack received his PhD in religious studies from Yale University, where he was later a lecturer in English. Formerly associate editor at the Yale Review, this fall he will be a lecturer in English and comparative literature at Columbia University. And he also writes the excellent newsletter, Phantom Heresy. Jack, welcome to Ordinary Unhappiness. We're so excited to have you with us today.
I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we are big fans of your work and so glad to have you on, especially at this moment. But before we really dive deep into your new piece in Harper's, or to picking your brain about a whole host of things, Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and about how you have come to do the work that you do?
Yeah. Maybe just because I am only able to think about things sort of on one track, the biographical and the scholarly for me are really bound up with one another. And so I was raised Catholic, I'm cradle Catholic, received a Catholic education, and in a funny way, in ways that I and my sort of peers growing up didn't really recognize at the time, it was just a thoroughly Catholic environment. That we really didn't. It was so Catholic we didn't quite realize that it was a Catholic environment. Catholicism was really the sort of background for all of my earliest encounters with literature, philosophy, history, culture, politics. It was part of the condition of understanding these things. I should say I went through like a pretty pronounced and distinct and predictable kind of rebellious phase where I fell away from the church. I once, I think I told you guys this once already, but I once formally announced to my parish priest in confession that I was renouncing my faith uh, when I was, I think, 17.
How'd
And
that go over?
he was very patient, and he's just sort of said, okay, that's not really how it works.
You can't speech act your way out of this. Yeah.
Well, you can't just say you're out, well, you'll always be part of the family of the church. And I said, well, I don't want to be. And he said, well, you may one day be grateful for this. And I was, and a slow movement back towards the church as a practice coincided with also pretty, fairly slow development in my own thinking and intellectual interests. Studied primarily, literature and philosophy. And as I was looking for a kind of intellectual home, a department, a way of pursuing further study in graduate school, I really found a place in religious studies, which is necessarily interdisciplinary, really interested in not just in particular expressions of different problems, but in how, as where the conceptual equipment of the modern world gets produced. And I don't think that you can think clearly about those questions without thinking about religion. The reason I'm interested in Catholicism as both a practice and as an object of study is that it fits really uneasily in the categories of the modern world, where on the one hand, it's an obvious sort of hegemonic force. It is in certain ways historically synonymous with European empire and the sort of global domination by the West and things like that. But it's also, insofar as the secular world emerges out of Protestant Reformation and different ways of thinking about religiosity, Catholicism is also sort of the primary object of critique in the modern world. So at the same time, it is exactly what we think of as a permanent institution. And it's also precisely what we tend to think of as what needs to be attacked, dismantled, restructured. And one never seems to win out over the other. They're always in tension, sometimes even within the church itself. So it's just, I wrote my dissertation about Catholicism. I tend to write much more frequently for the public now, for a broader audience. And it's just, it's news that stays news.
I'm vibing with so much of what you're saying, and I appreciate your voice out there so much because, and I'll just get my swipe in real quick. I have a real problem with the I'll own my snobbish. It's like I type of Johnny come lately, like new convert, fairly recent convert kind of moralizing, or like these invocations of like, well, subsidiarity actually means civilian casualties are great. Like this kind of wild shit where people are quoting Latin at you. And, never mind that Catholicism is probably just their stop on the way to orthodoxy, to neo-Gnosticism, to whatever the hell else they're going to go for. But this kind of really, shallow and disengaged kind of engagement with the church and its full complexity. And so your presence as someone who's talking about and your perspective as someone who has a properly ambivalent and overdetermined relationship with this institution that also doesn't subordinate it to narrow sort of polemical purposes is just vital in its own right. And I think it's just so cool to be able to talk with you. I did, in reading your work, go back to Freud's admiration for the Catholic Church in particular, and for not just for its art or for the beauty of its architecture, all of which he adored. But for just well, I mean, say what you will about the church, but it's definitely got an ethos or many ethoses. And also, as an institution, it's fucking durable, right? Its ability to propagate and to do things that, again, this is, Freud says at numerous points, totem and taboo most saliently, like, to get like people to do things like become monks or like forswear sexual reproduction in favor of life and the ever. Like, this is a real, and you got to hand it to the church for its ability to exist and to continue existing and to be a thing that both provokes controversy and also draws people in. But that is something that makes it properly fascinating. And again, I'm just so glad you're here and so glad to be talking about this stuff with you.
I mean, you're helping me articulate more of why I can't get off this train. I think a mutual friend of ours, Sam Catlin, turned me the other day to, I think was it maybe the second preface to Moses and Monotheism or something like that, where Freud, he wrote the first half before the Anschluss and the second half after it. And the second half, he just becomes bitterly anti-clerical. And the thing that he says, I'm paraphrasing, something to the effect of, we thought the church would save us. And it didn't. It broke, quotes Isaiah, broke like a reed in the wind. Now, I think there's a historical argument to be made about the extent, well, how accurate that is. But I think it's a heartbreakingly beautiful and devastating remark, not least because people, I think, tend to take Freud's relationship to religion in general as a polemical one, where it, to my mind, clearly comes from a place of deep affective, at least, investment.
Yeah.
The reason the church disappointed him is because he had high hopes for it.
So the occasion for our conversation today is your brand new piece for Harper's, which is called Radical Reformation, the Catholic Church's Progressive Revival. And Jack, it's phenomenal. Conversations about the Catholic Church in U.S. media and political discourse can get really parochial and really ahistorical and tendentious quickly. And, I just thought this was a wonderful piece, and it just presents this capacious historical and global political context. It's super nuanced. It's very dense. Like, you managed to pack an enormous amount into like 5,000 words, something like that. And so, take it as read, listeners, that you should read it, especially because it bears in so many ways on topics that have been of abiding interest to us on Ordinary Unhappiness, whether that's ideology or technology or the question of human suffering. So stipulating all of that at the risk of simplifying things, because your piece does cover such a sweeping amount of territory, could you walk us through the broad strokes of the portrait of the church that you paint and talk a little bit about the character of its contemporary conjuncture and how it got there?
Yeah, and thanks for the kind words. So I was asked to write the piece in answer to the question, basically, how did we get here? And I think, and part of the interest of the piece is that I think everyone will know what I mean already without specifying further. Anyone who's paying attention to contemporary politics, this is not coming from me as a Catholic.
Yeah, I'm paying attention. I mean, I pay probably more attention to the Catholic Church than your average non-Catholic, just as someone with a religious studies background. But I'm like dialed in now, right? Especially after the Pope decided to take on AI.
Absolutely. And I think more to the point was really deferred to and listened to. And it was seen as in ways that I think are kind of unprecedented. I think, we're all roughly the same age. I think unprecedented in our lifetimes, or at least since the sexual abuse crisis of 20 years ago.
Yes.
Since it really flared up 20 years ago, that people were saying with deep interest, what will the Pope say about AI?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody seemed to be asking, hang on, do we care again? Because we evidently do. And so I was asked to kind of give a historical, a kind of, as you say, a fairly rough read of how we got to this point where not only is the United States, in particular, tipping towards profound reaction, stripping of civil liberties, the destruction of labor power, everything that tips us towards fascism, but the Catholic Church is emerging as maybe the last effective moral voice, at least in the West and on the sort of global stage. And my answer is to really look back over the last 150 years or so of political history, both specific to the church and globally, to ask how the church has been fitting in politically in that period. And so it starts roughly with the collapse of the Papal States in 1871, where, in case people don't know, for the prior 1,000 years, a significant portion of, well, a constantly in flux, but nevertheless significant portion of territory was actually controlled by the papacy. The Pope was a properly political figure as well as a spiritual or religious one. And he would have conflicts, allegiances, interpersonal dynamics with other political leaders, emperors, diplomats, much as any other political leader would, in addition to being the vicar of Christ on earth. That ended with the Risorgimento and the unification of Italy about 10 years after, Garibaldi took Rome or whatever the actual event was.
So what you're describing, it's funny. I these are things like I was taught because we did a lot of church history in high school. The Jesuits made us do it, but also I never really thought about it in these terms. But that the point of departure is like a delinkage between the church as like the Vatican in terms of its occupation of like a state or like a state form.
Yeah.
Versus becoming another type of institution that is nonetheless like globally salient and interfaces with states.
Yes.
But that is no longer tied to a particular territorial sovereignty. And so that makes it something interesting in terms of the world system, in terms of the politics, and also in terms of like industrial revolutionary stuff, right?
No, that's exactly right. And the part of the historical development that I trace over the course, primarily over the 20th century, but the, last bit of the 19th and into the first bit of the 21st is that it is with the vicissitudes of especially European history, first with the kind of remains of the aristocratic ancien regime up through the Second World War, and then with the kind of NATO alliance following the Second World War, the church was always positioning itself primarily as a kind of spiritual, civilizational, both foil and guardian to European and, I want to emphasize this in their minds, therefore human civilization. What we've seen first with Pope Francis and then with Pope Leo, especially, I think even more radically so with Pope Leo than with Pope Francis, is that they came to see this kind of political alliance, and I use this phrasing in the piece, I think. They came to see these forms of political alliances not only as unsustainable, because obviously they keep breaking down. We keep having world wars. We keep having global shakeups. So they're not only unsustainable, but they're undesirable. That there is something about the way the church aims to constitute itself as a global institution that will no longer abide that close of a relationship or that synonymous a relationship with political bodies and institutions. That is the very rough trajectory of the story that I try to tell.
So I guess I'm trying to think about pitching this to people who have no horse in the game, where it's like, so like
dog. It's dog, guys. Both of you. It's dog and it's a fight.
Dog in a fight, not horse in a race.
Yeah.
Okay. A horse in the fight and a dog in the whatever. Like, and they're hunting too. Like there is this kind of thing.
A dog in every port. No, wait.
Where you're making me think again about what you spoke to, which is like the unspoken self-evidence of the weirdness of our contemporary conjuncture, where it's like, what does the Pope have to say about anything? Or like
that is properly funny if you are not Catholic. Like, what does the Vicar of Christ have to say about ChatGPT is like, not something I expected to be
but it
concerned with.
that gesture, that like appeal to like literally like authority, I guess you could say, but it says something, or it seems to track or be symptomatic to changes in like palpable changes and the anticipation of ongoing changes, the perception of changes of shifts in like legitimacy, right? Like incredibility of institutions in general, right? Like I don't want to, part of my brain is like, well, the Pope has a big platform and I'm thinking there's just like some like follower count, but like the guy's got a brick and mortar institution. Like there's, again, like the president has a platform and an institution, but who cares what that fucker says now? Like I mean, obviously we care in many ways, but also like, and I'm being sort of silly about this, but also like there is some, the ability to occupy a position of ostensible authority or like being the head of something through some process that isn't either thoroughly marketized or politically illegitimate, even on its own terms, is kind of singular. And I don't know who else we're going to like reach for, like it's like outside like Oprah. I don't know, I'm kidding, but like there's like some sort of like there's nothing else quite like the Saint of Peter out there. The Saint of Peter out there, like that's something. Faute de mieux, for want of better, the Pope seems like a last remaining keystone in something that we didn't quite understand was already an arch or a tumbling piece of ruins to begin with. I don't know. That's sort of weird.
It's so funny that you use Oprah as your example, because one of my advisors at Yale wrote her first book about Oprah in precisely these terms. That like, okay, we're facing like broad crisis of legitimacy. What are people looking to sort of both have a kind of vicarious but also subordinate relationship to, where you just get told how to live?
You know, as the among all of you East Coast folks, I as a child of Chicago, I feel very proud that both Robert Prevost and Oprah are being invoked here. It's like a rare moment where New York is overshadowed by Chicago.
There is something loaves and fishes about the like, there's a car under your chair, like this kind of like miraculous.
It's a really, I mean, it sounds funny
true
at first, but it's a really rich site there.
Okay, I want to go back to the piece. I want to go back to the piece. And in particular, I want to come back to that motivating question that you were asked to reflect on about how we got here, and ask, because, you know, one of the things I really appreciated about this piece is, you know, you touch on so many things that I feel like, you know, your average, maybe non-Catholic, just doesn't have that much of a sense of what you call like kind of countervailing traditions within the church. Because I think it's really easy to just be like, oh, that's like this conservative institution. But you take us into things like, you know, Gutierrez and liberation theology. I guess I want to ask if you can just kind of walk us through some of the intellectual movements and traditions in the church since the late 19th century, and especially in the 20th, that we are seeing reflected in the present.
If you're trying to think about the theological and political trajectory that led to this point within the church, there is a kind of helpful linchpin right in the middle of it, which is the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965, wherein a number of trends converged, and in certain ways blended in with one another. So and came back out the other side as a kind of a new program for how the church was going to develop in the modern world. And a lot of the mistakes, a lot of the overcorrections, the confusions of the subsequent, 60 odd years that we've been living in have overshadowed just how radical some of the sort of reform movements that went into the Vatican were. So part of the point of the piece, I was hoping, will be to direct some of the people to the sources of Vatican II rather than the more parochial political debates that have followed it. So on the political side, and a lot of people have been talking about this recently, is Catholic social teaching, which people tend to locate its beginning with Leo XIII's 1891 Encyclical Rerum Novarum.
And this is Leo XIII is who our current Pope named himself after. Is that right?
That's right. And he referred to this encyclical specifically as one of his motivations for doing so, because what Rerum Novarum was interested in was formulating the beginnings of the Catholic response to industrial capital. How is the church going to take on the obviously revolutionary changes that industrialism and global capitalism were going to wreak? Did so primarily by, and this is what many people will focus on, first by rejecting what he saw as the false promise of state socialism. He saw that as accruing too much power to the state and replacing more, I don't know if he used this word in the Encyclical, but I think it would be right to say more organic social forms, long-standing traditional social forms. And so people tend to say, oh, well, Catholic social teaching rejects socialism. It's a lot more limited than that, I think. But not least because he's also terrified by the ways capitalism also threatens all of these things. One thing that he really wanted to emphasize was the extent to which we were going to miss the labor guilds when they were gone, the crafts and labor guilds when they were gone. And so, as much as Catholic social teaching first gets formalized in Rerum Novarum, it's already very much ongoing. The Knights of Labor, the first major labor union in the United States, was a heavily, if not officially, Catholic organization, to the extent that the church was like a little concerned that it was going to supplant the church among its members. And in moments of crackdown, when the church became a little censorious about Knights of Labor, it lost a lot of people from the pews, which was one of the reasons people in the Vatican started saying, we need to find a way of both taking on the challenge of industrial capital and maintaining the congregation. The other, I would say, major intellectual trend that leads to Vatican II and that also leads us to our moment is something called the ressourcement tradition in theology. A number of extremely influential, brilliant theologians in France, Germany, Switzerland, elsewhere, beginning roughly in the 1920s, although they have antecedents, and up through the Second Vatican Council, were trying to find a way of both taking on modern philosophy, particularly Hegel, Marx, and Kant, and Freud to a certain extent, in a less polemical mode and more as interlocutors in the articulation of the modern as such, and also trying to find an ecclesial identity that basically preceded the 19th century. There had been so much standardization in the 19th century, both in terms of church governance and in terms of theology, to the extent that, not just Thomas Aquinas, but a very specific standardized, they called it manualist Thomism, became the official teaching of the church. It was what was passed out to every student in catechism across the world. And this also was related to a kind of Baroque liturgy. And as the church became more global, as local traditions were lost, both to the ravages of capital and to the sort of overweening influence of a centralized church, these theologians started looking back to the church fathers in the first few centuries of the church, but also to different readings of medieval theology. There's a real resurgence in mysticism in this period. They begin thinking much more seriously about the role of women in the church. All of this stuff comes together in basically a series of discussion groups around the Second World War. They are heavily, heavily suppressed by the Vatican in the 40s and 50s. Many of them are sent to implausible locales, stripped of their teaching duties, et cetera, et cetera. But with the election of John the 23rd in the late 50s, he effectively calls them all back into the fold and makes them the lead theologians of Vatican II. And some of these people will be Henri de Lubac, Hans Urs von Balthasar, John Danielou, Karl Rahner, missing a few others. But those, I would say, are the main long-standing trajectories and tendencies in the church that are getting cashed out now.
Is it right also that, Vatican II is the turning point where Mass doesn't just have to be in Latin anymore?
Yes. So again, it's as with everything in the church, it's always been more complicated than the sort of partisans of the issue will say. But basically, what we call the Latin Mass or the Tridentine Rite is formalized around the Council of Trent in response to the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, where the church is facing extreme challenges in Europe and wants to standardize and present itself as a unified, coherent, sort of internally cohesive institution. And it says, this is what Mass looks like. Prior to that, there was a wide variety of vernacular masses that medieval and earlier worship was. I don't want to overstate this and say it was constantly in flux, but it was very much subject to culture, geography, historical development. Sometimes it could be a source of real contention. Other times it was just a fluid process. That is one of the things that these resource model theologians are tapping into, is this longer and older tradition of liturgical diversity that has since been a subject of enormous contention, especially in Western churches, about what they see as the usurpation of the rightful place for the Latin Mass, as opposed to the ongoing negotiation of how best to celebrate the Eucharist in different contexts.
An immediate takeaway here, again, to beat the dead horse, or for people who all the metaphors, right, is the church, like founded on the Rock of Peter, is not monolithic, and its timeline.
Was that a geology pun?
Yeah, you like that. Also, there's a kind of the timeline here of like not even the timeline, like the political compass of trying to map what tendencies are dominant in any particular moment within the church is not reducible to like the horse race election cycle.
For sure.
So we've got this vision now of Vatican II as this liberalizing, probably isn't the right word, but Vatican II becomes an object of reaction, even as itself has this, probably we could call them progressive dimensions. And how does that shake out, right? People are definitely still pissed about Vatican II online, if I want to be like as limited as that. But like it clearly has taken some time to take or not take variously in different parts of the world.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. It has shaken out in many different ways, for good and for ill. Although I would, in my estimation, primarily for good. It's a source of contention online because it's an object for kind of half-educated reactionaries to sling their arrows at. And this really showed in the recent spat with the Society of St. Pius X, the sort of radical Latin Mass partisans who were excommunicated in the late, I can't remember the first time they were excommunicated. Anyway, they were right after a long process. Benedict regularized them and welcomed back into the fold under specific conditions, and they immediately started making trouble again. And as ever, the church was trying to give them as much rope as they could, with the firm line of not allowing them to ordain anyone. That was the one thing is, we can continue having a conversation about liturgy, just don't ordain anyone that is subject to our approval. They went and did it. They got excommunicated. And especially this time around, I mean, tragedy, then farce, and what comes after that, they just seemed so kind of sad, still railing against Vatican II after all this time. Nevertheless, it's still a source of contention in subtler ways as well, because it opens up real questions about how the church is going to operate as a global institution. Can it afford to be even superficially Eurocentric? What does it mean for it to still have a kind of, as you put it, brick and mortar shop in the heart of old Europe?
It's a struggle for brand definition right now.
It's a struggle for brand definition.
In an increasingly crowded, globalized market.
Flare-ups like this happen frequently, especially with somebody like Pope Francis, who is very happy to speak off the cuff, and when he referred to the church as one path to God, but that there are others. Now, pretty broad blanket statement. I think your average kind of secular agnostic would say, like, "Oh, that's nice."
Very inclusive.
Very inclusive. But it is at once sort of to the letter of the catechism. In how the church was going to relate to other religions, especially after the Holocaust, but in the sort of post-colonial environment in general, where that old style of, to be fair, somewhat caricatured style of colonial imposition evangelization, once that had collapsed, it is both totally to the letter of Vatican II, as it tried to reckon with both the Church's historic anti-Semitism and also its uneasy conscience about some of the more egregious aspects of colonial evangelization. And it's also precisely the kind of thing that, the trads, as we call them, see as a prime target. Oh, he no longer thinks that the church is the sole path to salvation. Well, that's not quite what he said. Again, how Vatican II shakes out can be at once really bland and really normalized, really diffuse. We're going to try out guitars at Mass or something like that. It can also be really deep, long-standing theological issues that get expressed in, liberal platitudes. It all requires a lot of sifting. It gets very dense very quickly.
I'm going to paint with such a broad brush here, Jack.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do so also as the only person here who is not either actively Catholic or
in remission.
What did you say?
Or in remission.
In remission. Patrick, whether or not you identify as Catholic, you were an altar boy, right? You were shaped in the crucible.
I was fully interpolated
of the church, sure. But I want to, also speak for those of us who have always been external to this tradition. It seems like now you can be a leftist and you can be a Catholic, right? And and you're both of those things. Again, I told you I was going to paint with a broad brush, but again, part of I think what's happening in this piece is that was there all along, right? It isn't, and for us to cherry pick pieces from an encyclical from 2026 and be wow, this seems really, really surprising that this comes from the Catholic Church. That's actually quite an ahistorical perspective, that there's continuities all along.
Yes.
And that there are rich traditions and resources from within Catholicism itself that are not new, that, make it explicable that, for instance, the current Pope does have a certain moral authority on a world stage and does so in ways that resonate with people that are across the political spectrum in a wide variety of places. Does that make sense?
I hear what you're saying. And there have been call them left tendencies in the church. And even longer than what I've been talking about.
Sure.
One of the first really important critiques of private property is Thomas More's Utopia.
Yeah.
And, the bishops are fighting against the enclosures in the 16th century. Now, that's not something that the left has never taken notice of. Marx famously referred to as Christian socialism as, what do you call it? Antacid for the ruling classes, Harper. So
Incredible.
I think that it's not totally ahistorical to be somewhat surprised by these tendencies coming to the fore again.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a helpful distinction.
Both because, for reasons I lay out in the piece, the church has long had a much happier relationship with, let's call it the sort of democratic center right, the NATO as a shorthand, the capitalist West, than it has ever had with anything, certainly with, the communist East when it existed, but, even with social democratic movements in the global South, for example. But also because there's a real problem of recognition on the left and the extent to which the left sees itself as a secular and secularizing force. That's one thing that I think we have just barely begun to face, not as, writers and scholars of the subject, but as people who see ourselves as on the left. What do we mean when we say that the left is a secular movement? It's one of the things that I really worried about writing the piece, is whether it sounded a little bit too Pollyanna about a rapprochement between the church and the left, or if not Pollyanna, just premature. because we still don't have a sort of social settlement about what we mean by the secular.
I think that's, I'm thinking about that too now in relation to, I guess, like this. I think, look, I mean, cards on the table. I think there are people for whom, count myself among them, right? Like, there are political questions on which I remain antagonistic towards the church, and in a world in which I'm building a coalition, right? I just stipulate for myself, we don't, like the right to reproductive health care, or I don't know, like
you can say the word abortion.
Abortion, yeah, please. Or even on like, I'll go where Biden would. I'll go where Biden wouldn't. Fuck.
Bravely, After he's dead. Wait, no.
And say the word. No, I think he's.
Hey.
Yeah. You see what's garment. We're keeping him alive for as long as possible. Sorry, that's but
we're keeping that in.
Yeah.
Dan, don't cut that.
Like, where people immediately leap to like and hell, even if I want to like, not to tell the Catholic Church how to run its business, right, in that brick and mortar thing, but like, I'd love for like there to be, I'd love for there to be a woman in the front office. You know what I mean? Like,
they are making strides. They look like small strides, and they probably are. But it's at least a live question, and has been for the last few decades in a way that it wasn't before.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the detail that I want to gesture at, which is that like, the temptation is to like, particularly when it's a question of defining what it means to be left, to sort of self-appoint as like the Pope of leftism and be like, no, this person's a fellow traveler. This person's actually like, you immediately start playing kind of fantasy coalition building in your head, right?
Yeah.
And like, what trade-offs am I being asked to make? And am I being asked to affirm this or that? And I think that's I think the anxiety in some ways, right? And I just want to bracket that to be like, well, let's just think about the complexity of this institution, even independently of thinking strategically versus tactically about where we work with the church about various things, right? Like, you at least have to recognize these institutions for what they are and for the contradictions they contain, because otherwise you wind up in like catalogic places, and you also wind up like, if you'll permit, I'm coming back to you wind up like getting a type of blinkeredness vis-a-vis the possibilities for moral suasion, or like what held the church in its existence, no matter how you feel it has to teach us about. And even as leftists, you want to use that language. And if you forgive me, right? Like, I'm thinking about this lovely thing you said earlier, this very trenchant thing about how the Pope can sometimes seem to be speaking in platitudes. Or Abby, you were thinking about this too, like, well, there are many paths to God. Everyone's like a liberal platitude. Yeah.
It's perennialism.
Yeah. But also like, it's like, it's like, it feels stock, right? There's nothing behind it there necessarily when you hear it as its own phrase. And then I don't know, I was thinking about this text, reading it, and like, there is to talk about the church reckoning with itself and its own capacity to sort of deal with difference. There is a really remarkable stretch about, atoning for, or at least acknowledging and beseeching forgiveness for the church's role in slavery, right? Mm-hmm. And again, some people are like, oh, well, this is, like, you immediately want to decompose this. Some part of your brain cynically, like, this is like the woke gesture or whatever. Like, you immediately start breaking into these terms. But then later, when there are these sections on working and exploitation, and like that are called the new slavery, right? You got a line, if you'll forgive me, just like, in some regions of the world, children and adolescents work in dangerous conditions, crushing the materials from which rare earth elements are extracted. The bodies of these people are scarred, injured, and worn down so that computational flow may continue uninterruptedly. And never mind, like, holy shit, as style, or like, this is alongside Marx. You're like, okay, it's not just about slavery in the past. It's about a type of oppression that is continuous to it in the present. And again, I found myself thinking of the other kind of like stock dismissiveness that you get as a leftist. Sometimes, oh, you're making this critique from your cell phone, made by slavery, made by capitalism. Yeah, I am making this fucking critique from my cell phone. But this is the Pope. He's not on his fucking cell phone. He's in Rome, and it's speaking across this sort of position of centuries to this continuity. And it's like, yeah, I am speaking about that. I'm also speaking about this, and I'm occupying this position of historical sort of contiguity and moral witness, which is not on the level of, I don't know, like, my individual anxieties about leftism, right? And that's worth thinking about that. I don't know. That's how I'm sort of like sitting with this. Like, that it's the fucking Pope.
Well, like, what it made me think of actually is when when you're describing your experience of like the contrast between the voice you speak in and the voice that the Pope is capable of adopting is a certain kind of like social situatedness that
Yeah.
that you're calling on for that, where you're just like, this actually doesn't really have anything to do with what I believe or with, you know, any of my particular ambivalences or even antagonisms toward what the Pope is on a day-to-day, if I had to make a decision about what the church should be, et cetera, et cetera. I just live in a world where there is such a thing as a Pope, and we all have a sense of what that means. And that in itself is significant. It's also really telling when we think about our antagonists, our actual antagonists, our political enemies, somebody like J.D. Vance or Tom Homan or the president, all of whom responded to the Pope's criticisms by saying, yeah, you can stay in your lane, or, well, yeah, I guess we could disagree, but, you know, we're going to keep doing our thing. The fact that they are not alive even to that social assumption, regardless of how you then respond to that social assumption, is really telling about the kind of, about how they feel about their position in the world and what they owe to other people. It, like, in a certain way, the cliche of like arguing with the Pope being at least odd
That's
is really politically revealing.
Yeah, and that's like, and I guess that's what I'm trying. Again, it's hard to talk about. It's hard to even articulate because it involves thinking about your own situatedness in material discourses, but also like imagined solidarities, or even like the ability to have some platform of moral witness yourself, right?
Yes.
Like when I'm in a Twitter fight online or getting angry at my neighbor, and I either invoke the suffering of those in the third world, or they rage bait me by being like, you're on an iPhone made, you know, with parts that are extracted from the Congo. We both exist in a very different relationship than the Pope, some of whom's faithful, maybe in those minds, or in any event, is speaking from an institution that has just also done this sort of reckoning with its history of slavery, but that has a tradition of, well, I mean, the Pope's been there, right? The Pope is, and also he's a fucking American, but also there's something about the capacity to voice a moral claim in relation to some kind of logic of solidarity that is different and something other than the imaginary that the political discourse that we otherwise have forces us to speak in terms of.
I mean, are you talking about something other than moral authority?
Maybe I am. Maybe I'm
just
struggling to talk about a word that otherwise doesn't exist much.
Yeah, I was just like, that feels like what you're talking about. Jack looks like he's going to say it's not.
No, I wouldn't say it's not. But I think maybe something a little bit more specific to it is a word that has taken on a kind of technical meaning, but has a long, you know, ecclesial and religious meaning, which is institutionality. Like what does an institution do? How does an institution think? To quote Mary Douglas, like what is it's, you know. I mean, Patrick, you brought this up earlier about like we are in a moment of institutional crisis. You know, institutionality as such is in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the three of us with our fraught tangential relationships to the academy, that's what we immediately think of. But it's also the crisis of the nation state, of the multinational, of the corporation, of the union. Like none of us seems to know how to occupy an institution, if indeed an institution is something we occupy. Whereas, like, you know, to use the sort of like Catholic schoolboy example, you know, the monastery is the model of the institution. And it was a place that you went not just to get a credential, not just to pick up a language, not just to make friends. It was a place that you went as a form of ascesis, as a way of shaping who you are as a human being, not to make your decisions for you, but to provide a framework of decision making that can produce a moral perspective.
And honestly, that does sound in 2026. And my card's on the table now. I did used to live in a monastery. It was a Buddhist monastery. But you know what? Like in 2026, like it just sounds so restful.
I still am terrified by it. I mean, as a cat, I was really preoccupied by all of this stuff as a little kid.
Yeah.
And especially like elementary school ages, like single digit years. when I learned that there was such a thing as a monastery,
Interesting.
I just figured that I would end up there,
right.
and I was deeply ambivalent about it.
Interesting.
And whenever I think about it now, it's still this relationship of attraction and repulsion. It's just like I simultaneously am like, you know what? I think maybe every problem would be solved if that had been my fate. I think I just wouldn't have problems if that. And also, I think like, yeah, but also like I'd be dead. Or I would be in constant pain or something. I think that's part to widen the aperture again a little bit. I think that's part of what's so interesting about Catholicism as a religion is that it has this like infinite gradation of institutionality where for the spiritually talented, for the beautiful soul, for the self-torturer, there's a place. And for the, sounds like a good idea, I don't know if I care enough to try it, there's a place for them too as well. And I think that's another thing that is making people a little bit more receptive because the church is starting to emphasize that a little more. It's starting to say like, no, listen, like we will just come to you and you make what you will of it. It's no longer outside the church, there is no salvation. Again, a reckoning with what institutionality is.
Jack, at the risk of asking you both like a really blunt and also impossible question, are you scared?
I'm excited.
Can you tell us what's going on with the American Catholic Church? Like, what's going on with its relationship to conservative politics and also to claims of authority and legitimacy? In the piece in Harper's, you pinpoint, and we love the shout out to Freud, a Cold War, quote unquote, kettle logic of the church being, quote, both participant and referee in the ongoing culture wars, defending traditional values against the supposed march of libertinism, if not liberalism itself, while staking a claim to the liberal order that made such progress possible to begin with, close quote. And now, you read the paper, we have J.D. Vance basically telling the Pope to stick to playing ball. Like, what's going on? What can you tell us?
I mean, at the risk of just like jumping into the sort of academic knee-jerk historical reference, so that I don't have to answer contemporary political questions, I do think that in order to understand, like, again, what produced, in dealing with all of this stuff, it's always so telling what kind of questions people ask. And the question you ask, like, what on earth or what the fuck is going on, is what everyone's saying. And so what's with the vehemence, or what is with why is it surprising? Why is it a question? Well, one of the reasons it's a question, I think, is that for the last 100-odd years, the American church has been really preoccupied with this kind of positioning of itself, where at the same time as it wants to represent itself as a kind of guardian of principles standing athwart history, it also wants to be the sort of the paragon of the modern assimilated institution. Now, I'm painting with an extremely broad brush here, and to actually tell the story of American Catholicism, you need a lot more time and space than we have or than I had in my piece. But basically, the church is, for its first period in the States, effectively the quasi-pagan religion of the ethnic poor. I mean, it has other valences, especially in global terms. Colonial anti-Catholicism really gets tempered by French participation in the war, French funding of the Revolutionary War. That actually had a real effect on, for example, George Washington's interest in toleration. Basically said, like, well, we can't piss off the French now. And so that led to some repealing of anti-Catholic laws. In the 20th century, with these great waves of European migration from Catholic countries, we started to see real tension not dissimilar to what we're seeing now about what it means to be an American. One of the things that nativists pointed to as making somebody not an American was being Catholic. And the church saw that at once as a kind of feather in its cap, as a still strong institution, but also as a real threat to its membership, because if it's between the church you go to on Sundays or the community that you belong to in your local enclave and this massive, increasingly powerful state and also culture and ideology, I think it wasn't sure whether it was going to win the fight. Between Catholicism and Americanism, there was a real contest, still is to my mind. So the question of Americanism has always been a contentious one in Catholic thought and in church politics. And one of the ways it responded to that was by becoming more and more conservative, and in ways that were increasingly recognizable to American political conservatives. The other way it did that was to insinuate itself in institutions of higher learning, in the law, in government, both in its own institutions like Georgetown or Notre Dame, these sort of what we now think of as like American as apple pie, and only secondarily as Catholic institutions. How this all produces the situation that we're in now is also, in a funny way, it's just to ask how we got here politically. How did the sort of first secular republic, founded on, of course, initially nominal, but the ideal of universal suffrage and participatory democracy, end up in an increasingly autocratic oligarchy?
This really just underscores the way in which, to repeat it, like thinking about the history of this institution goes against the grain of thinking about the timelines and histories of other institutions, by which I mean, like, it is truly striking how, on the one hand, anti-Catholic nativism, right, is a foundational tentpole for like the second Klan, right?
Yeah.
And then to think how literally 100 years later, the forces of like white racist reaction include among them at the same time self-professed Catholics now, and I'm going to bracket just whatever the freakishness is that's happening on like the Supreme Court. Just I don't even want to get into that, but like something about the particular type of the scene of here. I'll just say this very bluntly. I'll make the politically crude statement here. Even as I'm not a Catholic, to witness J.D. Vance, a convert to the faith, lecture at the Pope about just war theory, or to be like, the Pope should just stick to moral issues. Some part of me was so mortified, right? Just like so, it just grotesque in this kind of way. Never mind that the Pope is himself, an American guy. Like there's some point at which like it offended my sensibilities, and not necessarily even in a proprietary way, but like perhaps in the way that like I've got this little interjected Jesuit priest who's like smells of cigars and whiskey and who is just yelling scandal, like just like fuck you. Like it just so completely patently absurd that it highlighted some sort of disjuncture, right? The way in which a certain type of American exceptionalism, a certain type of American nativism is, and here again, I'll parlay some Freud, like it is a type of manifest destiny or a dogma that feels religious, right? It really is Americanism in that 19th century heretical sense. And it, on the one hand, I can think of precedents for it, right? And part of me feels also like there's a history and farce aspect of it. Because I'm like, well, yeah, I can imagine leaders of states having longstanding quarrels with the Catholic Church, right? If there's anyone that's going to be the Henry VIII of our era, it probably would be Donald Trump. And I guess by extension, like maybe J.D. Vance is going to get like the Thomas More treatment, but not because of principles, but just because like really fucking annoying, right? But like, there's so clearly an evacuation of legitimacy and moral authority, or even like an ability to take the protestations about the universal seriously.
Yeah.
from some of the people that are speaking in terms of this tradition, that it again, like, just you. How can a person claim to speak on behalf of the institution when they literally are in not only just like direct personal disagreement with the Pope, to say nothing of maybe killing the last one, right? But also to occupy the position, say that they do about like migrants, right? Or the immigration. Like it's not just unchristian or uncatholic. It feels actively sort of demonic to me in this kind of way that I can't deal with it. I can't even. That's
Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot to take on board. It's a lot to listen to daily. I'm reviewing his conversion memoir.
Oh, Jesus.
And he when I first was sort of flipping through it, he talks a lot about Catholic social teaching and about Rerum Novarum and about the need for, just economic arrangements and uninspired but also uncontroversial recitations of just like very basic Catholic orientation, that what is primary is the social. We can have discussions about like what kind of market economy we have, if we have a market economy at all. But what we need to bear in mind is that our primary obligation is to each other, not to profit. He says stuff like that. And it's just like, okay, that's kind of funny considering that you're like a venture capitalist who's bankrolled by Peter Thiel, but fine. He then uses that as the foundational argument for immigration restriction, because he slips in an ideal of what he calls social cohesion, where if you want to form a labor union, it's a lot easier if you all speak the same language, if you all have the same cultural backgrounds, so he takes what is explicitly intended as a universal teaching about the unqualified bonds of human solidarity against any other particular practice or form of community. So like against a company, for example, and twists it effectively to justify ethnic cleansing. And he does this in like a span of a couple pages. And it turns out in the acknowledgments, I wasn't totally familiar with this guy, but the name rang a bell. Pascal Emmanuel Gorby, PEG.
Oh,
He's a
Peg,
Twitter
that fucker.
troll.
Oh yeah, that
He's
guy's,
a Twitter troll.
yeah.
He's thanked in the acknowledgments
That guy's
of
awful.
J.D. Vance's conversion memoir as helping him sort through some of the theological issues in the book. And you just think like,
brother, I'm thinking about too, or the love that Rod Dreher would get when he had his sort of Catholic style thing, and people in like the New Yorker they're like, oh, he's so plangent, he's so beautiful. Whatever he did to him and Vance, but like this kind of like, is this actually what people think this intellectual tradition is, or like there's something about the poverty of again, I don't want to like. There's already this tradition right here. Right. I mean, there's already liberation theology, probably not coincidentally, in to the South as we ruthlessly exploit it. Right. But this is this sort of self-appointed national church in this very kind of like Reich era moment. It simultaneously parlays or appeals to this felt gap of moral authority and this entire like desert of legitimacy that we live in, while also being like the most absolutely cynical, twisted, and downright like perverse kind of caricature of it at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that the bishops, the U.S. College of Catholic Bishops, has been finding its voice lately in interesting ways. And like I mentioned in the piece, Cardinal Kupich in Chicago and Cardinal McElroy in Washington, D.C. being really trenchant and articulate critics of not just particular actions that the Trump-Vance administration is taking, but also basically their whole sensibility of not just saying we might have done this differently, or Catholic teaching pulls us away from these particular actions, but also saying like this entire way of orienting yourself towards the world is fucked. So that's been encouraging. I don't know. I have to say, I am actually not given to sort of any skepticism about converts. I just, and not because
sorry, I'm not trying to shit on that.
No, I know.
The self-selecting pundit demagogue convert is a species of their self, and fuck,
absolutely. But I'm realizing as I say that I think my criticism is even more snobbish on that score, because I just don't think he did convert. I mean, he went through it. I'm sure he said all the words and he said all the.
But you mean like in his heart?
In it, or his mind, or in like, I don't see how it's made him act or think any differently.
Oh, your criterion isn't like made him a better person. It's just made him a different person.
Yeah. Again, it's a church of sinners. So like, if someone's a convert and then is a total shit, if it's on Catholic grounds, then I'm kind of like, okay, well, anybody can interpret anything anyway, I guess. But the fact that it seems to have had no effect on him, no specific effect, that it's given him rhetoric with which to cloak his sort of his bait and switch to the uneducated working class, I guess.
Yeah.
It's given a slight frisson to his appeal to like the liberal commentariat, where now not only is he, a former hick, he's a Catholic now too. But reading through the book, there was nothing particularly Catholic about it. He keeps talking about community and social cohesion and culture. He's really resentful of people in this really uncharitable way. And then seems to think that like self-flagellating in this self-congratulatory way is enough. Nothing is different from Hillbilly Elegy. It's the same book, basically. And Hillbilly Elegy was before his conversion. So when he's talking about, telling the Pope to stay in his lane effectively, I'm almost not surprised. Because it's like, well, yeah, you don't have any particular feeling about the Pope. You're not a Catholic. You're not like... you don't in any way act like one.
I want to shift gears a little bit now. And since we have you here, I do want to talk about the Pope's recent encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas. But before we get a little granular, can you explain to our listeners who might not know what an encyclical is?
Yeah, an encyclical is basically a papal letter. And it comes from a tradition as old as the church. I mean, you can even, to a certain extent, think of the letters of Paul as precedents. That, I mean, you can hear it in the name. It's a circular that's meant to be distributed amongst the faithful. So the encyclical, as we know it now, begins in the 18th century as generally speaking, the Pope's articulation of how his papacy, the church as he helms it, will face a given issue. They tend to be social issues. They tend not to be strictly theological issues. They tend to be primarily for the lay faithful, and increasingly, to the world at large. I don't know exactly when this phrase came into common use, but most encyclicals now are to the clergy, to the faithful, and to all people of goodwill. And, there's a lot of confusion about what these documents actually constitute, how binding they are. Some people hear Pope and they think infallibility. This is a completely unrelated thing. There is some sense that's frankly a bit above my pay grade in which it's ecclesially binding, that there's a certain way in which the faithful need to engage with this document. But for example, the encyclical Humanae Vitae, which formalized and reiterated the church's stance on contraception, affirming the total ban, as it's often called, it was immediately met by what's called the Mayflower Declaration, which was a group of 100 theologians in the United States saying, this is not binding. That faithful married Catholics should continue to use their own judgment in matters of family planning. So they are significant documents. They do tend to set the tone for the development of the church's social doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
They are not the final word.
So it's like weighty, but not binding.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we still have papal bulls?
I was about to ask that question.
So an encyclical is not the same thing as like a papal bull, right?
No, I think a bull usually has some kind of like prescriptive.
That was my understanding.
Like
is like stop doing this, and there are consequences.
Right.
Whereas like, Leo putting this out, it doesn't mean that like all of the faithful immediately need to start using Claude in a particular way.
So,
Like stop vibe coding by order of the Pope.
Yeah.
That's not
I
this.
think I think it also has a more general binding valence as well, where it's like I think canonizations are made by papal bull.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay. That sounds right.
But again, they didn't let me do theology, so I don't have to care.
Okay, but I feel like that's helpful. But so Patrick and I did read.
That's the word we were looking for earlier, by the way. Abby and I were like, "What's beatification as distinct from what? Sanctification?" We were both.
I did
blanking on
not say sanctification.
I was like, "And sainted." I was like,
"Wait, what is the right word?"
Canonization.
Canonization.
Yeah.
Oh, because we were talking about the like what I found extraordinarily like insulting passage where it's like, and here are these great women.
And she
like,
said St.
"Fuck
Teresa,
you."
and I'm like, I was like, "Do you mean Lisieux or Avila?" Or,
And I was like a fucking
mother.
Calcutta, and he was like, "Oh, she's not mother anymore. She's saint. She's sainted."
Yeah, she got on the fast track.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Okay. So we did read Magnifica Humanitas, which frankly is not one of the places that I thought this podcast would ever lead us to reading a papal encyclical, but
Yeah.
it's an incredible document. I mean, I'm not co-signing every bit of it, of course, but it's incredibly clear. It's extraordinarily rich. It touches on so many things, from institutional history to the idea of history to employment policy to the immigration crisis to modern warfare, and more, especially including artificial intelligence. And I do want to just say that I know you did a fantastic episode with Matt and Sam over on Know Your Enemy just about this encyclical. So listeners, and I will link to that in the show notes, so listeners should definitely head on over to that. But for our purposes, which are, I think, a little bit different, I wanted to ask you a couple of things. And here's the first one. It's about Leo's views of technology in general and AI in particular. So what is Leo's view of our narratives and fantasies about technology and about how those relate to actual intersubjective human relationships?
It's a really great question. I think it cuts to the core of what makes this document both a distinctive critique of the way AI and the tech world in general is going, and also what makes it really characteristic of Catholic thinking. For Leo, and I would say for the sort of mainstream of Catholic thought, everything is a site of mediation. There's always a certain kind of encounter happening in every object. Technology takes on a particularly revealing and significant role in these encounters and mediating these encounters because they are specific intentional productions. He's not in any sense a Luddite, and the Catholic teaching is not in any sense wary of technology as such. And in fact, I think he would see that as a kind of category error. Like, technology is simply something human beings do.
Yeah.
Let me give a quote, or I'll just throw a quote.
Please.
Yeah. So technology has the power to heal, connect, educate, and protect our common home. But it can also divide, exclude, and generate new forms of injustice. In the abstract, technology in and of itself is not a solution to humanity's problems, just as it is not inherently evil. In practice, however, technology is never neutral because it takes on the characteristics of those who devise, finance, regulate, and use it. This seems like just true. I mean, it also seems like what someone in STS would say, or like any philosophies of talent, but just that, yes, that just seems correct.
Yeah, absolutely. And so part of this is a critique of a certain kind of naturalization of technological language where, I mean, you see, again, one of the reasons AI is so interesting is that it seems to be reifying certain language that has always been implicit in the way that we talk about technology. But I think everyone has always assumed that we knew we were using either hyperbolically or with a certain, as a shorthand. But what I'm thinking of now in particular is technological progress and how it has come to seem like a just a natural development. Of course, we will always produce the next thing. Until this, until our moment, I would have thought that even a sort of radical rightist technologist would say, well, but it's not strictly speaking natural. We're making decisions and we have certain goals. It's just we've all come to an agreement about certain conditions. And so we don't have to, rehash everything with every new invention. Now it's clear, no, there are a lot of people who think of this technological advance, if advance is even the right word, as simply foreordained. We just have to do it. AI is here is the phrase that we're all bludgeoned with constantly. And now people who are not Luddites, people who have, a healthy appreciation of technological ease and convenience are saying, okay, well, if it's going to take all of our jobs, just stop making it. Just turn it off.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what Leo is saying, or the political critique that Leo is making room for in saying that our technology is always predicated on our priorities and decisions, and most importantly, our pre-existing ideas about ourselves and other people, is that it's creating space for alternatives, for people to say, actually, I'm not accepting that we have to do this. We may end up doing this, but it's going to be subject to discernment in the same way that everything else is.
There's this bit that I've been looking at in the section that's called What Must Not Be Lost. And this is in a discussion of what it means to, quote unquote, safeguard our humanity. And he's kind of ventriloquizing the worldview that is expressed through AI and through the sort of like, it's here, just get used to it. Yeah. But also like, what does that mean for the conception of human persons? And so here we are, quote, in that vision, the fullness of life is equated with having more, reducing weakness, eliminating uncertainty, and exerting total control. And here's the part that's like really just so good. When efficiency becomes the ultimate measure of value, human beings are tempted to see themselves as a project to be optimized, rather than as persons called to relationship and communion. Close quote. I think that's gorgeous, first of all, but I just think it's right. Like, there's something that's incredible to me. I mean, I spend a reasonable amount of time in San Francisco, and I always have this sort of sense, like after, it's you land there, and it's like, oh, this is so wonderful. And after a few days, it starts to feel like incredibly dysphoric because you're like, oh, I'm in the place that produces everything that I hate about,
right?
Like that, like you fuckers are the reasons that every time I open Microsoft Word, Copilot shows up, right? You stole that however many minutes from me I had to take to like figure out how to make that not happen. And it feels like he understands not only like the technology itself, but like the ethos in such a deep way. It just has this real like, what am I trying to say? I've read a lot of theology. I haven't read a lot of encyclicals, is the truth, but I have read a lot of theology. And a lot of times it is doing cultural criticism about the time in which its author is writing, right? So like, there's nothing new about that. And of course, like, Robert Prevost I should probably call him Pope Leo. Pope Leo, nay Robert Prevost, of Philadelphia and Chicago before Vatican City, like in Peru.
And Peru.
And Peru, very importantly,
Crucially,
home of liberation theology. Right. He's a modern guy, even though he doesn't look modern, right? Because he's wearing the papal robes.
He knows HTML, right?
But
he did their website.
This, yes. There's something that just I find so striking about how thoroughly he has grasped the mindset of everything that AI represents and is just kind of turning it inside out and saying, and again, in a way that I find people in my own field of academia really unable to argue that persuasively, possibly because they lack the moral authority, but also perhaps because they also lack thousands of years of theology to draw on that does and that does understand the status of the human being as something that is sacred, right? Like I that's not something I can reach for in a small liberal arts college classroom, right? And I don't even want to necessarily. I don't want to be like, don't vibe code because you were invented in God's image. Like that's not my approach. I'm like, don't do it because it's pretty important that you be able to like think and love. But I don't know. I was moved by this document, and I was also I was moved by it emotionally, but I was also moved by it in the sense of like it articulated a persuasive, moral, and practical case against the rampant adoption of large language models and the misrecognition of them as things that actually think in a way that I just really haven't seen anywhere else.
I wonder if there's something going on with like the lexicon or the history of being able to talk about like hypostatized abstract entities, but also like errors of thought and tendencies of like self-reinforcing like messianisms even, right? But that there's...
Well, in sin also, this is a fucking error, right? Like we need to course correct.
It's like
right?
AI doesn't have a soul, right? It's like there is no there. It is giving you back to yourself. And one of the dangers is that can make you less interested in others. And that is...
Yeah, Jack calls it a narcissus in the article.
It just fucking tracks. Like it just makes sense, but it also, again, you can say this cohesively.
Yeah.
I think part of, I mean, you've already sort of touched on it, both of you have, but I think part of what makes him able to talk this way is precisely that feeling of course correction and the idea that a real recognition that, contrary to what many people sort of assume, that the church has had an integral role in developing the sort of technoscientific paradigm that now rules the day. That it always tried to place in the context, a broader context of human solidarity and dignity, and increasingly, I think, is seeing as having failed in its historic duty to protect against this kind of depredation. In the same way that I think it genuinely did believe that it could, the bishops believed that they could protect the peasantry against exploitation by feudal lords or whatever, and that had a lot to do with Catholic political quietism over the years, that it saw its role primarily as just protecting people, protecting the institution, just making sure that the people right here, right now, are not taken advantage of. And with that kind of focus over the years, I wonder if Leo looks back and says, we also let a culture metastasize around principles that we helped produce and did nothing to stop from being interpreted in the worst possible way.
That's so important. It's so clarifying for me. I think there's something about, to put it in slightly different words, perhaps this is why, I find this so sympathetic in some ways, like the vision of what we would call civilization here is one that includes its discontents. It's one where the givenness of progress or of inevitability distinct from our efforts or relation to a thing is not it's not taken for granted, right? There's this work of triage, there is this work of skepticism towards like the promises of technological prosthesis, right? Or to these fantasies of basically wish fulfillment or of infantile kind of deferral of what should probably be your agency to others, or even to abstractions, but that also ramifies as a failure to think in terms of solidarity and a failure to acknowledge others. And I think in some ways, like the cultishness or the theology of Monkey that you get out of some types of Silicon Valley forms here, I think of everything from like long-termism, right? Or Rococo's basilisk or whatever that fucker is.
Rocco's basilisk.
Okay. But like the lengths
like
to which
Rococo better.
It's Baroque. There is something going on about like you have to invent all these hypothetical scenarios about persons in the far future. Right. In ways that just so happen to erase your own agency, but even the ability to think of people present, right? Like it's so again, like not just like, it's not crypto theological. It is a type of theology, but again, it's also like kind of like literally you're summoning a demon, right? But the demon is like your own kind of blinkeredness manifest back to you. That this cuts through this. It has the resources to do that, and I find this like really, I find that compelling. I find that like again, of course, it is very Freudian, right? There is like this is his attitude towards the disappointments of progress, the limits of technology, but again, like his appeal to like, what is the function of this thing as opposed to what people say is its function? How do we relate our own responsibility, or rather disidentify it and like disavow our responsibility to these things, like our own creative potential? Like, what does this actually do? And how does accounting for its multiple registers of function demand an account that thinks about individuals, but also thinks about groups, that thinks about the natural world, but also thinks about our agency and shaping it? Like there's a capacity to like both be dynamic and descriptive, but not to be narrowly moralizing here, which I found very compelling. And again, like lacking in many other places, right? It's again, probably it's not a coincidence that I'm reaching for like Freud, when he is the Pope of psychoanalysis, being like, now I'm going to tell you about fucking civilization. But it is kind of that you don't get this a lot, or if you get it, it's just some asshole on Twitter or the vice president, which might as well be the same thing.
One other question for you about Magnifica Humanitas, which is about this category that shows up all over the place and is perhaps one of those things that both of you understand better than I do as like members of the fold, or sorry, Patrick, previous member of the fold.
What's your end game here, Abby?
This is feeling
asking
intentional.
a real question about vocabulary. Why do you think that I have to have some sort of agenda, nefarious agenda?
I don't know. I
didn't grow up with this stuff. Okay.
No,
What I want to ask you about is this term discernment. It seems super, super important, and it feels like maybe it's something that I know how to do, but I don't really know how to explain it. And it seems interestingly related to some of the things we talk about in terms of psychoanalysis, in terms of a kind of like almost like a relational wisdom. So I was hoping you could speak to that category for our listeners.
That's a really nice way of putting it, relational wisdom. And I would amend it just only slightly by saying like relational struggle towards wisdom. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to pick up on the word. It's one of there are a couple words that I just think of as just like, there should be a Catholic font that they're always printed in. And discernment is one of them. Analogical is another. Imagination sometimes. But so discernment, I mean, discernment is in a certain way, well, one hears it most often when talking about vocations, about people who are thinking about entering into religious life, be it the priesthood or some kind of monastic order, where when you first feel called to the vocation, you enter into a process of discernment. And it's the same way we use the word colloquially. You're just figuring out if it's right for you. But it has deep, deep theological implications. And in Catholic high school, it was a sort of constant. Some of you will be called to a vocation, but all of you are called to sort of discern your path. And insofar as every path leads to God, finding one's own place in the world is equally a way of finding out your particular way of relating to God. And I mean, there's a line in St. Augustine in the Confessions that is often cited as, the definitional desire of discernment, which is, let me know myself and therefore know you, speaking to God. This relates directly to Pope Leo, who is famously an Augustinian, referred to as the purpose of the church. When he's saying that the church isn't political, quote unquote, when he's not, when he's saying don't talk about the church in terms of party political categories, he said the church's purpose is the formation of conscience. Now, again, it's like we were saying earlier, it's not setting out the rules for you to follow. It's providing the site, the context for that kind of discernment. And in the most sort of grand, mystical, but I think still theologically grounded way, it's also a way of participating in the ongoing act of creation. That is what human freedom consists in, and what, for Thomas Aquinas, for example, would say distinguishes us from every other kind of being. Although I don't know why you have to say that, but they often do, is that we are able to participate in our own creation in that way. That our intellect, our will, is reflexive in just such a way that we can take, as it were, the material that we're born into, the psychic material, the spiritual material, and reshape it. We can actually discern our own character, and then produce it in an effective way. There's a certain kind of mystical application of spirit to its own making. So that's the full gamut. Sometimes it just means whether you should be a priest, and sometimes it is theosis. From Paul's letter, that when he says that God became man, that man might become God. That's the full run of discernment.
But Patrick, did you have a passage from Magnifica Humanitas that you wanted to read?
I'll just read this bit. This is a couple sentences and then a chunk of sentences. But our relationship with life seems to be in crisis today. Everything that appears as a, quote, limit, incapacity, illness, old age, suffering, vulnerability, tends to be seen primarily as a defect to be corrected, rather than as a reality through which humanity matures and opens itself to relationship. And yet we must remember that humanity flourishes not despite limitations, but often through them. And then here's the bit that, I don't know, it hit me like a gut punch reading it. I'm going to try and hold it together now. And among other things, I realized it contains a theory of trauma and more. Even when limitations are experienced as inner suffering, human wisdom teaches us not to deny or suppress it, but to integrate it. To eliminate suffering entirely would mean, in the end, extinguishing love and desire as well. Those who love and desire cannot avoid passing through trial and suffering, and over the years we carry within us lessons that leave their mark like scars, the memories of a journey shaped by freedom and failure, dreams and disappointments. It is only thanks to the interplay of these elements that the wonders of the soul occur within us, allowing us to sense the richness of our humanity. To renounce this adventure, both tragic and splendid, in the name of a presumed transcendence of all limits, could mean many things, but it would no longer be human. There's something there about, as we talk about discernment, I think like the capacity to see your life in those terms, or the willingness to think through experience, to integrate experience, and to think about, not in like the fetishized Catholic guilt way, like what wisdom comes from suffering, as though suffering were some sort of good, but like how do both joy and suffering involve some sort of project of how they can help us realize some kind of project of self-cultivation that could be described as wisdom, and also an orientation to the other is, I found myself responding to it independent of the theological context of it. I just thought that was compelling and beautiful and simpatico.
Yeah, I mean, I think what this encyclical really emphasizes, and it's been in the tradition from the beginning, but it's becoming more and more apparent now, is that the Christian view of life, or the Catholic view of life, is that it is primarily a practice of revision, not of original production and not of simple reception, but of ideally increasing, but in any case, ongoing act of repetition, refinement, care, correction to some extent, but all of it predicated on the idea that the creative capacity to think and to behave differently is more than anything else a sign of divinity. That that is what makes us human, is our ability to revise our condition. And that, again, that's like everything proceeds from that. Temporality proceeds from that. And when you have a technology like large language models or something like that, which is all about instantaneity and is all about trying to reduce questioning as swiftly as possible, negate it entirely. You plug in a question, you get an answer. You don't get further condition. I mean, that people, I think this is part of why people protest so much about like developing relationships with their chatbots or whatever, where they want to really insist that it's something that can develop over time, because they know all it is just, it's just the scroll. It's just sequentiality. It's not actually duration or human temporality in that sense. It's not the kind of time in which revision happens.
Can you believe that we did 2.5 hours on Catholicism by way of psychoanalysis without mentioning confession? That just occurred to me.
I meant to earlier.
I was thinking about this. I was thinking about this line. I don't have it in front of me. It just like floated up to me while you were talking. I think it's from The Question of Lay Analysis when Freud is like, in confession. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have this book with me. It's like, in confession, the penitent tells all. In analysis, he tells more.
That's great. That's really telling. It's funny. I just read today that fewer than a third of church-going Catholics regularly go to confession.
Huh. I would think it would be one of the big draws. Therapy is very expensive.
So there's a question about the kinds of people who are regular church-going Catholics and whether they would go to therapy and whether there's not a hint of therapy in confession that turns people off.
Oh.
I think that's one thing.
Okay.
I think confession also strikes people as one of the real like atavistic albatrosses around the church's neck. Like you have to go and confess your sins, and then you have to have the man tell you that you're okay if you do these certain things. Point being, all of these are total caricatures glossing over one of the like most interesting and curiously modern features of the church, which is confession.
Yeah.
You go, and again, it's one of the curiosities of the cliche of Catholic guilt, because everybody's guilty. It's really only Catholics who get to go and have them all wiped away on demand.
It's honestly the only part of Catholicism I've ever been jealous of.
Yeah.
It never
It's
took for me,
great.
though. I mean, like
I always wanted to like go into the confessional and whatnot and be like, what's this like?
It's performativity, it's ritual, it's therapy, it's analysis, but we were all taught, especially in like the increasingly sexually neurotic, 80s and 90s.
Oh yeah, sorry.
To go in and say all the bad thoughts you had. And so as a child.
Yeah.
And so it was just horrifying. It was a mortifying experience. You go in and you say to this guy who's,
hopefully not enjoying too much. Yeah.
Who's there. And, there are all these debates. And this is what I mean about some of the like boring parochial debates post-Vatican II about whether the confessional would have a screen or not. You're just like, come on.
That sounds actually very interesting to me, but okay.
It's an interesting question, but about whether...
I bet all the clinicians listening are like, what is the therapeutic frame of confession? And how is it different with a screen?
I agree with you. It's very interesting. It's secondary when people are leaving in droves.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter when no one's showing up.
Point.
It's a very Lacanian screen. You project onto it. There's no one there.
Yeah.
Okay. Jack, this has been, we could keep going, but I am.
We could.
Before we go, where can people find you? Besides in that little booth, confessing your sins, like on the internet, for instance. Where can they find
on the
you?
internet?
And where can they read this piece? Also,
right. So that's the big thing. This piece is the essay in the August issue of Harper's magazine. Presumably, it'll also be online. You can. You already mentioned my newsletter called Phantom Heresy, where I post frequently enough, although not as frequently as I keep saying I will.
Another thing to confess.
It's another thing to confess. It's also where I, promote all of the pieces that I have elsewhere coming out. I do have a website, jackhanson.net, but there's nothing on there that you won't find sort of just Googling. There's going to be more stuff in the works. We're talking about some possible future events. There are reasons to sort of keep tabs in the near future.
Well, thank you so much. This has been such a generative conversation. We went a lot of places I expected us to, but also like many places that I did not, which is one of my favorite kinds of conversations.
It was a blast. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really, really appreciate it. And thank you.
This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Jack Hanson. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.